Welcome to the deep dive. So, today we're going to be digging into this really powerful idea, one that you hear about a lot in cities all over the world, the right to the city.
Exactly. And we're using David Harvey's book, Rebel Cities, as our main guide here, looking at key parts and the full text, too.
Yeah, the aim is to really get under the skin of it, understand how capitalism shapes our cities and these constant struggles over who actually gets to decide what they become.
And for you listening, especially if you want to get a handle on these big, complex issues, fairly quickly, this deep dive should give you some real clarity.
That's the plan. Our mission really is to unpack what this right to the city actually means, where it came from, and why it's frankly so vital today, especially with capitalism being such a huge force in urban life.
Maybe we should start with Paris. Paris in the 1960s. It was a really key moment of transformation. The sources talk about this real tension
Tension between what exactly?
between, the old neighborhoods, the historic city, and this kind of emerging, maybe slightly soulless new Paris with all the tall buildings going up.
Ah, right. And didn't Godard capture some of that? I think the sources mention his film, de Trois choses que je sais d'elle.
Yes, exactly. It's like a snapshot of that feeling, American companies moving in, the Vietnam War echoing in the background, this massive construction boom changing everything, and consumerism really taking off.
But there's a contrast there, isn't there, between Godard's sort of philosophical take and Harvey's view?
Very much so. Godard's is maybe more fragmented, this sense of things falling apart. Harvey, though, he really focuses on the energy of the urban social movements. He
Yeah.
sees them as, well, maybe more important than just the intellectual debates.
Right. And Harvey suspects, even without definite proof, he says, that some of those movements, like the ecologists,
Hmm.
they kind of merged into the '68 protests, feeding into their political and cultural demands.
Which brings us neatly to Henri Lefebvre. He's obviously a huge figure when you talk about the right to the city.
But Harvey's point is, it's not just about studying Lefebvre's theories in a vacuum, is it?
No, exactly. It's about understanding what was happening on the streets, the actual movements. That's maybe more telling than just, dissecting the texts.
And there are real-world examples, right? Like Brazil.
Yeah. Those sources mention Brazil's 2001 constitution. It actually guarantees the right to the city. That shows the power these movements can have real policy impact.
And Lefebvre himself, he didn't see this as just tweaking things, did he? It was revolutionary for him.
Absolutely. Not just reform. And you could argue that revolutionary edge is even sharper today. Think about it. The old industrial working class, it's declined in many places.
Right.
But you've got this rise of the precariat. People in insecure jobs, often low paid, but who are absolutely essential to keeping cities running.
So claiming this right to the city, are we talking about claiming something that in its old form maybe doesn't even exist anymore? Has it been changed too much?
That's a really key point. The author suggests it's become what's called an empty signifier,
Ye-
meaning it's a term lots of people use, but it can mean radically different things depending on who's talking. So the crucial question is, who gets to fill that signifier with meaning?
Okay, so financiers and developers might claim it one way?
Right. And homeless people or undocumented migrants might claim it in a completely different way, both using the same phrase.
And that's where the struggle lies. The author uses that Marx quote, doesn't he? Between equal rights force decides.
Exactly. It highlights that the definition itself is fought over. It's a power struggle.
And Lefebvre's view was that capitalism itself, this kind of endless, sprawling development, has basically destroyed the traditional city.
He felt it had killed it. Yeah, this unchecked growth.
Hmm.
So for Lefebvre, the real political job is to imagine something completely different, to rebuild a new kind of city.
That sounds like a huge undertaking.
It is. It means, according to him, a really strong anti-capitalist movement that's focused specifically on changing everyday life in the city.
And he learned from the Paris Commune too, right? That you can't just create socialism or whatever in one city alone.
Precisely. External forces, the broader capitalist system, will always push back. But his core idea remained. The people who actually build and sustain the city,
The ones doing the work, living the life.
yes, they have the primary claim, this unalienated right, he called it, to make a city more after their own heart's desire.
Which leads to that almost paradoxical
The
statement,
city may be dead.
but long live the city.
Right, yeah. It captures that tension.
So is chasing this Chasing a ghost, a chimera, as the author puts it, in purely physical terms.
Maybe in purely physical terms, yes.
Right.
But the political struggles it inspires are very real. It's not just about, say, getting access to a park.
It gets more fundamental.
It's about the power to actually create new kinds of common spaces, new ways of being together politically.
And the idea of the city itself just carries so much weight, historically and symbolically. Citizenship, utopia, it's loaded with meaning.
Definitely. Lefebvre talked about this quest for centrality. Even if the old city center has been blown apart by sprawl, that human need for a focal point keeps popping up.
Like in Tahrir Square in Cairo or Zuccotti Park.
Exactly. Cairo, Madrid, Athens, Barcelona, Madison, Wisconsin, Zuccotti Park. Places where people spontaneously gather to make their voices heard. It's powerful.
But then there's the clash, the sort of urban revolutionary romanticism that gets attributed to Lefebvre.
Yeah, and the hard reality of capitalist power. Those moments of vision, of possibility, they're often short-lived.
You have to grab them.
You have to grab them, otherwise they fade. Lefebvre also talked about heterotopic spaces, these sort of alternative pockets within the city where new ideas can grow.
Like seed beds for change.
Potentially. But
Yeah.
they're often eventually, co-opted or smoothed over by the dominant ways of doing things.
So it really circles back to this idea that the kind of city we want is tied up with the kind of people we want to be.
Absolutely. What kind of social relations, what values, what connections. The right to the city isn't just about getting your individual share of resources.
It's bigger than that.
It's a collective right. A right to change ourselves by changing the city. And that takes collective power over how urbanization happens.
There's that quote the author uses. The freedom to make and remake ourselves and our cities is one of the most precious yet most neglected of our human rights.
Makes you think.
It really does. And it makes you ask, okay, this incredible pace of urbanization we've seen, has it actually made life better for most people?
Or are we just, more alone, more anxious,
Yeah.
monads in an urban sea, as the author puts it?
Right. People were writing about this way back in the 19th century. Engels, Simmel. They saw this emerging urban personality, the anxieties alongside the excitement.
And today, with change happening even faster, we still see that mix of discontent and thrill.
Yet, as the author points out, there seems to be a real reluctance, a lack of stomach maybe, for a deep, systematic critique of it all, despite the obvious issues. Like massive wealth concentration side by side with poverty.
Exactly. The huge disparities, the consumerism.
Mm-hmm.
It's right there in almost every major city, but maybe we're just overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it.
Okay, let's maybe switch gears a bit and talk about the engine behind a lot of this. Capital accumulation. The sources remind us that cities have always been places where surpluses are generated and usually controlled by a few.
And capitalism, fundamentally, is about that relentless search for surplus value, for profit.
Mm-hmm.
Capitalists have to reinvest that profit to make more profit, to stay in the game.
Which creates this constant drive for expansion, a compound growth effect.
Precisely. It has to keep growing. But there are always potential roadblocks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Finding enough labor, getting raw materials, making sure people can actually buy the stuff.
Maintaining profit rates.
All of that. And the responses are key. Finding new markets, creating new desires through new products.
Yeah.
Using credit, getting the state involved.
Which leads us back to Haussmann's Paris, doesn't it? Starting in 1853.
A classic example. Louis Bonaparte basically gave Haussmann the job of solving two problems at once. What to do with surplus capital and what to do about unemployment. Urbanization was the answer.
So it soaked up huge amounts of money and labor.
Massive amounts for the time. And, importantly, it went hand in hand with authoritarian control, suppressing worker demands. It was a way to manage social unrest, too.
And they used innovative finance, grand plans.
Oh, yeah. Things like the Credit Mobilier, the Credit Immobilier.
Mm-hmm.
These were new kinds of debt instruments. It was essentially, as the author notes, a kind of early Keynesianism. Debt-financed infrastructure upgrades.
And the result was?
A total transformation. New infrastructure, sure, but also a whole new urban lifestyle, a new kind of Parisian identity. Paris became the city of light.
But not everyone benefited. You mentioned the Paris Commune earlier. That was partly a reaction to this, wasn't it?
Definitely. There was real nostalgia for the older cityscape. Haussmann had swept away, and a powerful desire among the displaced, the working class, to take back their city.
And within the commune itself, there were different ideas about the future.
Yes, competing visions. A more centralized socialist idea versus a more decentralized anarchist one. That conflict had long-lasting effects, leading to that big split between Marxists and anarchists later on.
Okay, let's fast forward. Post-World War II, USA. Similar problem, right? Surplus capital after the war.
Yes, the war and then the Cold War spending absorbed a lot, but there was still this underlying issue. And again, like in Paris, it needed political management. Think McCarthyism.
And Robert Moses comes into the picture. He'd studied Haussmann.
He had, back in 42. And what followed in the U.S. wasn't rebuilding city centers like Haussmann, but this vast project of suburbanization.
Which wasn't just building houses either, it was a whole lifestyle shift.
Exactly. It created demand for so many new things. Houses, yes, but also cars, appliances, roads, oil. It was incredibly effective at absorbing that surplus capital.
But with huge downsides for the cities left behind.
Absolutely. The hollowing out of central cities, the creation of inner-city poverty, especially for African Americans who were largely excluded from the suburbs through redlining and other practices.
So it seems this cycle of urbanization fueled by capital just keeps going, but it's also prone to crisis, like the property bust in the late 60s, the 73 global crisis.
Right, which hit New York City really hard, remember, bankruptcy in 75. And then it was this sort of roller coaster of regional booms and busts until the big one in 2008.
And until 2008, the common wisdom in the U.S. was that housing was actually propping up the economy.
Yeah, that it was the stable bedrock. It turns out, not so much.
And this pattern went global. Property booms everywhere.
Pretty much mirrored the U.S. in many places.
Yeah.
But then you have China, which is just on a different scale altogether.
Oh, so.
The sheer speed and size of urbanization, the focus on massive infrastructure projects, huge cities growing almost overnight, has been a colossal absorber of global surplus capital.
And underpinning all this is the global financial system, right? Debt financing projects everywhere.
Exactly. Increasingly interconnected, making the whole system potentially more vulnerable, too.
What about the impact of this more recent neoliberal phase on city life? The 2008 crisis hit some groups harder than others, didn't it?
Very much so. Low-income African Americans, single-parent households in the U.S., were disproportionately affected by predatory lending and foreclosures.
You had all that speculative building on the edges of cities, then swaths of empty, foreclosed homes.
Yeah. And the response from the Fed was basically to pump money into the banks, which raised worries about inflation down the line. The big question now is, can China keep absorbing the surplus, or are we heading for another crash?
And it feels like the quality of city life itself has become more of a commodity.
Definitely. Access is increasingly based on money. We see the rise of tourism, consumer culture, the knowledge economy shaping cities globally. Postmodernism even encouraged fragmenting the market into niches lifestyles as consumer choices.
Which leads to more polarization. Extreme wealth next to poverty.
Stark polarization. The author gives examples like Manhattan real estate, Mexican billionaires, while incomes for many others stagnate or fall.
And you see that physically in the city.
You do. Fortified fragments, the author calls them. Gated communities, private security, public spaces under surveillance. The neoliberal focus on protecting private property becomes the dominant common sense, even for people who aren't wealthy.
It sounds a bit like what Engels was describing back in 1872 with Haussmannization.
There's a definite echo.
Mm.
Engels saw it as the bourgeoisie's way of dealing with the housing question. Cut through working-class areas maybe for public health or beautification on the surface,
But really,
often to make it harder to build barricades to control dissent. And crucially, he argued, it doesn't solve the problem, it just pushes it somewhere else. The same economic forces recreate the slums elsewhere.
and that process of conquering central Paris took decades, pushing the poor further out, leading to later unrest in those isolated suburbs. You see parallels with Robert Moses in the Bronx, too.
Absolutely. Engels also understood how city growth itself pushes up land values in the center. Old buildings become unprofitable relative to the land value.
So they get torn down for something that yields higher rents.
Exactly. Leading to displacement. Sometimes people move willingly, sometimes it's resisted, sometimes it's brutal. Think of the scale of displacements in China recently. And Lefebvre saw this coming decades ago, the blurring of urban and rural.
We need to be careful about solutions that sound good but don't fix the underlying issues, right?
Very careful. The author is critical of ideas like Hernando de Soto's focus on property rights for the poor. It sounds progressive, but it ignores the basic lack of jobs. Or microcredit.
That sounds positive, too.
It can have some positive effects, say, on gender dynamics sometimes. But it can also just trap people in debt, ultimately benefiting the lenders, as Eliachar observed in Cairo. It doesn't change the fundamental structures.
So wrapping some of this up, urbanization has been absolutely central to how capitalism absorbs its surpluses, expanding across the globe.
Yes, a crucial role. but always at a cost. This creative destruction, the dispossession of masses of people from having any real say, any right to the city.
And periodically that leads to revolt, the Commune, 68.
Exactly. So the question is, what makes today's urban movements different or similar?
The answers are probably more complex now, given how global everything is, how fragmented the city feels.
For sure. But the author uses that Leonard Cohen line, about the cracks where the light gets in. There are signs of revolt, of challenge, everywhere.
Unrest in China, India, movements in Latin America, Europe.
Yeah, lots for ferment. Now, linked to this is how the surplus itself is controlled. Historically, the state always taxed some of it away, especially during social democratic periods.
But the neoliberal shift aimed to change that.
The goal was privatization, to put control of that surplus value firmly in private hands. Though, interestingly, the data shows the state's overall share of output in OECD countries didn't actually shrink as much as you might think.
Still, the 2008 crisis showed a real asymmetry, didn't it?
Hugely asymmetrical. Millions lost homes in the U.S. Entire neighborhoods were boarded up, ruined by predatory lending.
And those people didn't get bailed out.
No bonuses for them. Some even faced tax bills on forgiven debt. Yet the financial institutions, the ones who caused the mess, got massive public bailouts. Why bail out the banks, but not the homeowners? It's a critical question the author raises.
Which brings us back full circle, really, to reclaiming that collective right, the right to shape urban life, to reinvent the city.
It connects directly to that age-old question. Who controls the link between urbanization and the surplus generated? Who benefits?
And the conclusion is pretty stark. The revolution today has to be urban.
Or nothing. That's Lefebvre's challenge, and Harvey echoes it. It has to be grounded in the reality of urban life.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the key takeaways are really about seeing that long history, haven't they? Urbanization tied to capital, these cycles of boom and bust, crisis.
And this persistent, ongoing struggle over the right to the city. Understanding these dynamics, hopefully, gives you, the listener, a lens to look at your own city.
Yeah, maybe think about how these big historical forces actually play out where you live. What does the right to the city feel like or look like in your community?
Are there movements, struggles happening? What potential do they have to create something more, well, more just, more equitable?
And maybe this is the final thing to mull over, is this whole idea of an urban revolution from Lefebvre. Is that just, well, wishful thinking, a utopian dream?
Or is it something more?
Yeah.
Maybe a necessary response, really, to the way capitalism shapes our cities, something we're seeing play out right now. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.